Hi, and welcome to the fourth topic in Chapter 7, the cranium and facial bones. Before we get started, take a moment to review the learning targets for this topic. In particular, note that there are a wide variety of reference materials, more than in any other chapter that we've had thus far. There are tables, figures, complete sections, and also reference plates as well. So be sure to look for those in your resource materials. All right, let's start with the cranium. Okay, the cranium has a variety of different functions, starting off with the simple protection and enclosure of the brain. It also provides attachment points for muscles, whether they be chewing muscles or muscles that can move the head. One of the little known functions is that the cranium contains air-filled sinuses, and this is designed to reduce the weight of the skull itself, but also to increase the intensity of the voice. Now that we know some of the functions of the cranium, let's actually take a look at the bones that make up the cranium. Now, some of these bones are single bones and some of them are paired. There are 8 total, with 2 being paired bones and 4 being single. The first bone that we're going to talk about is the frontal bone, and it is a single bone. It's the bone that you see here in sort of this orangey color, and you can see it from this anterior view, but also this side view. It forms the upper portion of the eye sockets. As a matter of fact, there are 2 small holes located right here and right here called the supraorbital foramen, and this serves as a passageway for both blood vessels and nerves. The next bone that we're going to talk about is the paired parietal bone, and you can see one on this side view right here, but you can also see another one in this back view that you see right here. Okay, so it's a paired bone. Now this bone is actually fused along a suture line called the sagittal suture. Okay, so the parietal bones, again, fused by the sagittal suture. But the parietal bone meets the frontal bone at another suture called the coronal suture. And you probably remember both of these terms from our planes of space study. The next bone that we're going to take a look at is something called the occipital bone. And again, a lot of these terms should sound familiar because it's just like the surface anatomy terms that we learned earlier in the unit. This forms basically the back of the skull. It too has a suture line, but you can actually see this a little bit better from this back view. So if you take a look, this is called the lambdoidal suture. Okay, so this is where the occipital bone is going to join the 2 paired parietal bones. Now also, there's another interesting part of the occipital bone, but you can't see it unless you look at the bottom of the skull. Okay, there is a large opening, and the name foramen magnum actually means large opening. And this is where the spinal cord is actually going to venate into the skull and join the brain. The next bone that we're going to take a look at is the temporal bone. The temporal bone is this bone that you see located in sort of this orangey color right here. Okay, and its suture line is called the squamosal suture, which is a nice name for it because you remember squamous actually means fish scale, and this bone does kind of have a fish scale shape. Okay, it forms basically the sides or base of the cranium. When you rub your temples, you're probably coming in contact with that temporal bone indirectly. Okay, now the temporal bone has a number of landmarks that you need to be familiar with. And the first one that we're going to talk about is actually something called the zygomatic process. The zygomatic process is this bony ridge that you see right here. Okay, and together, along with this blue bone called the zygomatic bone, which we'll talk about in a second, forms what you probably commonly know as the cheekbones. Now, the reason why it's called the zygomatic process is that it's leading to the zygomatic bone. So its official name would be the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, which is why both of these are colored orange. Now, the temporal bone also has an opening, a small hole, and that's located right here. This is called the external auditory meatus, otherwise known as the ear canal. but there are two bony projections right below it. One is a bulkier projection that you see right here. This is called the mastoid process, and the way that I always remembered this is I think massive or mastodon or something kind of large, okay? Whereas the styloid process kind of looks like the word stylish, and I don't know why, but this looks like the heel of a pointy shoe, okay? So just think mastoid process is the larger one. It's an attachment point for the neck muscles, whereas the stylus process is an attachment point also for muscles, but ones that are basically going to anchor the tongue and the pharynx. The next bone that we're going to take a look at is a bone called the sphenoid bone, okay? And this is probably one of the most unusual bones in the body because it actually has almost like a butterfly-like shape. There's sort of a central piece with two wing-like structures, and it can be seen in a variety of different views. Like, for example, you can see it here from the underside of the skull. It's this fuchsia-colored bone that you see right here. If I were to remove the bottom of the skull, you could still see the bone located again in fuchsia right here. But if I were to look at a side view, only a small piece is going to show located between that zygomatic and that temporal bone we talked about a second ago. Okay, now there are a couple of notable parts in the sphenoid bone that you need to be familiar with. The first is called the sella turcica, and this is actually a small little indentation in the bone where a very important gland is going to sit or reside, kind of like a rider sits in a saddle. And that's actually what the name sella turcica means. It actually refers to a Turkish horse's saddle, and this is where the pituitary gland will sit. Okay, now this bone is wedged between several different bones. You can see it connecting to the temporal, the frontal, and the palatine. The next bone that we're going to take a look at is the ethmoid bone. Now, this bone is challenging because it's so difficult to see. As a matter of fact, you can only see a sneak little bit of it poking out right here, highlighted a little bit better in this colored one that you see at the top. But here's what the bone actually looks like. As a matter of fact, you can see a smidge of it poking out right over in through here. Okay, so it's actually two masses joined by something called the cribriform plate, and that's actually what we're highlighting in this area that you see right here. Okay, it also forms the roof of the nasal cavity. The crista galli is also another important spot because this is actually where the meninges, which are the membranes that enclose the brain, are going to anchor themselves or attach. The perpendicular plate is another significant area, and this is actually going to project downward and form part of what's called the nasal septum. Now we're going to move on and actually take a look at not the bones of the cranium, but the bones of the face, okay? And there are basically 13 immovable bones and one movable lower jaw, which we'll talk about last. But the first bone that we're going to talk about is one called the maxilla, okay? You can see the maxilla in this picture right here. It's sort of this lighter green color, but you can also see it forming the roof of the mouth. If you were to remove the lower jaw, you could actually see that top part, which is sometimes referred to as the hard palate. Okay. The next bone that we're going to take a look at is the palatine bone. This is also another difficult bone to see, like the ethmoid bone, because it's located or buried deep within the skull. It has an L shape to it, forming both a horizontal component and a perpendicular component, so kind of like the letter L. Okay, and this is the palatine bone. You can see it highlighted in green, and you can see a small piece of it in sort of a turquoisey color in this little diagram that you see right here. Now the next bone that we're going to take a look at, we mentioned already. This is actually called the zygomatic bone. And this forms basically part of your eye socket, okay? And together with the temporal process and the zygomatic process, you form something called the zygomatic arch. And this is what is commonly referred to as the cheekbone. So here again would be that temporal process, here's the zygomatic process, and together they form the zygomatic arch, aka the cheekbone. The next bone that we're going to talk about is the lacrimal bone. The lacrimal bone is a thin scale-like structure that's located in sort of the inner portion of the eye socket medially, okay, so closer to the nose. And it's associated with a gland called the lacrimal gland that we'll learn a little bit more about in the sensory unit when we talk about the eye. The next facial bone we're going to take a look at is the nasal bone. And you can see that being highlighted here in yellow, also in yellow in this upper diagram. Okay, this is a long, thin, rectangular bone, okay, and it's fused at the midline. It's actually two separate pieces that kind of fuse together, and this is what is commonly referred to as the bridge of your nose. Now, the next section that we're going to take a look at is a bone called the vomer. This one is also really difficult to see. As a matter of fact, if you look through to the red color that you see in the background right here, okay, this is actually the bone called the vomer. It is most notable because it forms part of the nasal septum. Now there's a small scroll-like bone that you see here in number 18, and this is actually called the inferior nasal concha. Okay, and this is basically a scroll-shaped bone that's going to form part of that nasal cavity. Okay, the last bone that we're going to talk about is that movable bone that you see here in purple. This is called the mandible. It's one of the strongest bones in the body. It has both a horizontal shape to it, but then there's also these upward projections called the ramus of the mandible. Okay, and that takes us through topic number 4. Thanks for listening. Until next time.